so I can upload this video later. This camera looks like it's not pointing at me at all. That's a little better. What I'm going to show you today is my process over the last, I think it's over the last week or so. It's pretty much since the beginning of the semester. I started animating a shot too. I recognized that in previous classes, how I would do this is I would make you all scoot to the front of the room, and I would just sort of work on parts of this, and I would animate a shot in front of you while I talked about it. And everybody just, it's like, that's just hard to do in a classroom setting. But the reason I did that is because that was the thing that was always missing in education for me. People would tell me to read a book, or they would give me a tutorial on how to walk through a certain project. And I understood all of that, but what I really wanted to do was find somebody who did this for a living every day and sit there and watch them work for 8 hours. Like, I wanted to see exactly what they did, exactly what decisions they were making. And for a long time, that stuff just didn't exist. Like, the closest you could get was like, here's another book that has the 12 principles of animation rephrased in it. Go think about those for the next 5 years. This is stuff that is becoming much more readily available, but has always been the stuff that made me progress the fastest. Watching other animators work, even if it's just snippets of it, I take elements that I've been doing inefficiently, or I take elements that I have not been thinking enough about, and I just take information away from that and implement it into the way that I work. So you all have created some form of character animation at your time here at ETSU already. What I hope you get out of this is just how to take this back to your work and implement it, right? So, but I wanted to walk you through it in a way that didn't put you to sleep. So what I've done is I've time-lapsed different phases of my blocking pass, so you can watch it happening at a faster speed while I talk over top of it, right? I'm starting with this reference video that I found on YouTube, and I forgot to credit the kid's name. If I upload it to YouTube, I'll put it in the liner notes. Oh, he's freaking amazing. Like, this kid, this video was from a video clip that was him doing 50 different variations of wall flips. Everything from like bouncing on his bed, wall flipping in his house, to like all this stuff off these trees. He was climbing up between walls. He's 10 years old in most of these, and I thought it was pretty neat because it was a pretty athletic act that usually you don't, like, usually when you see parkour videos or athletic videos, you don't see little kids doing them, right? And I'm a huge fan of several comics where little kids are just badasses. Hit Girl in the Kick-Ass comics, and X-23, Laura, when she's really young in those comics. Like, those scenes are just freaking incredible. Like, this little kid just like being awesome. So I decided to kind of use that. I think it really kind of struck me. One of the things I think in the personality or appeal part of it wasn't necessarily he did this really cool flip. It's that when it's over with, he does this like, what? Like, he just does this like, this like stance of like, you want to fight? Like it, and you see it mostly in the side view one. And it just had a lot of personality to it. And I was like, oh, I want to do like some kid in the middle of like some sort of battle scene, right? So I'm using a rig from Josh Sobel's rigs. I think it's in the animation reference. He's the same one who does the Bonnie rig, but it's the Kaylee and Kyle rig. And so I'll show it to you in a few minutes. But basically what I did with this reference is that link that I put on D2L, I converted it to an image sequence in Premiere. So I found the video clip I wanted. This is the time lapse of it. I found the little snippet I wanted. I trimmed it out. And so I'm picking this first jump, making sure I get exactly what I need. Trim all that, delete the audio. And then I'm just exporting out an image sequence at 24 frames per second. Now, the original video, I think, was shot at 30 or 29.95, but I needed 24, So that's where you change that in there, and you can watch the longer video of how to do that. But when it's over with, I have one image for every frame of that animation. My next step is setting that reference up in Maya. Now, in the process of doing this, I'll point out that I've already done a little bit of work before I even got to this point, which was setting her up in this scene, kind of getting a tree model. Like, this is sort of my proxy tree. I'll probably, if this turns out good, I'll do a better tree model. But the question did come up several times throughout the last couple classes, do you need to do all of your own modeling? And the answer is yeah, but don't spend more than like 20 minutes on it. Like, make a couple of polygon primitives and set that up. So I'll probably let this one loop twice so you can see the process. Once I have this scene set up, I set my camera up and I lock my camera. So my camera is in the right position of how I want to animate this shot. And so I created a new polygon plane, and I apply a texture of that first image in the image sequence. And then I tell it to use image sequence in that texture. So you'll see that happen here in a minute, right here. So you select the first image and click use image sequence. And now whenever I'm on frame 24, it looks for image 24 in that image sequence. So as I scrub my timeline, that video in the background will update in real time. This has been one of the most beneficial elements of working recently that I've implemented into my workflow. I animated for a long time as a professional without doing this, so it's not absolutely like required by any means. But what I will say is my animations got significantly better when I started doing this. The reason for that is even if you're doing it like side by side, you have it open up on a video player beside you and you're scrubbing and then scrubbing back in Maya and then trying to implement that in there. There's like a lag, there's a disconnect, right? I'm having to use my brain to operate two different software packages and then take the information I'm getting from that and implement it into the pose. Here, I'm just using Maya and glancing up in the corner to get information about how I need to implement that information from the pose into my character's pose. Right? So all that stuff we did in the sketches, by the way, don't forget to turn in the sketches. Up in the network, there should already be a folder. And just looking around, I think most people have already turned them in. If you need me to rename any folders or anything, let me know. All that information you've been pulling from that, that's what the next steps are, right? So instead of doing those sketches, I mean, and you can do the sketches for them if you need to. That's probably a good way of thinking about what's going on in the pose. What I'm going to do is I'm going to analyze that contrapposto, line of action, and silhouette and start putting them into my character's pose. Oh, let's see, close that thing. Okay. So these are the first two poses for the animation. I decided to do two pretty drastically different poses. Right? One of the things you'll notice I'm doing right now is I'm kind of testing out the rig. I'm making sure that before I go too far into this, everything is set up the way I want it to. I rescaled her a little bit, but I also thought of stuff like, if you'll notice when I start rotating her spine, notice that her arms and head stay in their own orientation. That's a control I had to turn on the rig in order to get that to happen. You can go back and see if you can actually see that somewhere in here as I start rotating it. So yeah, switch that to IK. So like you'll see that as I rotate that spine, her shoulders sort of stay in the same orientation. That makes it way easier for me to animate, and that's just how I like to animate. I also put her arms in FK to make sure that I can get clean arcs out of it. This is me just trying to figure out how her spine works, because I've never done a longer shot with this character before. Again, if you're interested in using this character, it's not free, but it's pretty cheap. It's $12. And Josh Sobel is the guy who makes them. So the two poses I was going to start with was my first real pose on screen. So I want my character running from off screen onto screen, and I decided to go for a passing pose because that was sort of the first clear pose I see him hit in my video reference. So I get my passing pose, so this is kind of my starting pose on screen. Now instead of walking through the run cycle one pose at a time, next I go to like a main storytelling pose, which is the point that she leaves the ground, right? Now notice I'm not moving the placement control, I'm moving the feet and the hip, or in the root control, and I'm getting the point where she's sort of jumping up off the ground. Something else I really want you to pay attention to, I am posing everything. I'm posing all the way down to her pinky finger. I'm posing in just a second here. I realize her face is just a little too bland. I go ahead and put some face poses on there. One of the things that it's consistent every semester, every time I try to teach the pose-to-pose workflow, people leave things out of the pose and say, I was just going to do the hands later. And I promise you that is the absolutely most difficult way to do this. If you just do some form of hand pose, altering that hand pose a little throughout your animation is way easier than going back later and creating 50 hand key poses, right? Like this is so much easier to just pose it a few times and work on it. Now here is where I realized I made a mistake. Actually, it was a little further back. I don't know if you noticed this. I spend a big portion of this time posing her with her right foot up and her left foot back, which is what I thought was happening in this pose. And then a little further into it, I realized, oh, I'm wrong. I used the wrong foot, and I have to reverse that. So it's not too big of a deal. It was a little bit of an annoyance, but it was way better to fix that now than later. So right there, I'm like, wait, what? And so I think I've fixed it by this point. Yeah, no, this is where I started fixing it. Okay, I was like, dope.
Right.
Yes.
So these bits are on the network?
Yeah, they're on the network in the resources folder. Yeah. And I'm actually recording this video of me talking through it. So I'll probably also be posting that on YouTube, and if you're following my YouTube page, you can get it that way, or I can post a link of it. Now I want you to notice some of what I'm doing here is I'm trying to clarify that silhouette. I want to make sure that back hand is sort of clearly showing in the silhouette. Right? Also, you probably noticed what I just did there is I went back. Probably noticed what I did here pretty close to the end is I open up the graph editor and I put this in stepped mode. Now in Maya, you can right click on the timeline and choose stepped preview for some rigs. But if your rig is using a lot of scripting or things that have to calculate in sort of in a time-based media, I don't necessarily know how to explain that better than that. But mainly scripting is where it ends up happening. If there's scripts that are driving part of this rig, sometimes that stepped mode messes up the rig. And so enable stepped preview wasn't working with this rig for me. So what I'm doing is just going into the graph editor, selecting all of her controls and setting them all to stepped. It's also important to recognize that I am keyframing every control that she has. She has hidden controls on her face that adjust the angle of her eyelid, and I'm setting keyframes on those controls every time for every key pose because I don't know what I'm going to need in the future. Yes?
Along your top down.
Yeah,
all those quick picks, did you manually do those?
I didn't do that. He basically set those up for this rig, and it was kind of hard to implement those in there. It's basically a custom shelf that picks them all. But I would recommend you having some version of this. There's a couple of ways of doing it, but making a menu like quick button like that is the best way. A lot of the TrueAll rigs have selection sets that are already established, and I can show you how to use how to create a picker for those. It's not always ideal to just drag select all the controls, because you may be selecting something that's not a control, like a joint, and then if you set keyframes on that, it may mess up the rig. So figuring out a clear method for that is an important part of the step. I can show you a couple of different ways of doing that. I think I showed most of you that on the BinBot rig, but if you'll remind me, I can show you that some more here in a minute. So again, pay attention. I am really thinking about silhouette on everything. Her fingers, her elbow, like all of this stuff. What is going to make this clear to this camera, to the render cam, right? And the reason for that is because that's the one I'm going to render. Right? I'm using my perspective camera to tumble around so I can get different angles on it and figure out the physics of it a little better. But I really want this camera to look good, which means I had to establish that camera before I even started. And I think that's one of the other mistakes a lot of people make, is they don't establish their camera until they're well into the process. So I'm like, how do you know what your silhouette looks like? You have to establish that as early as possible. Yes?
You said it was really important to select all the keyframes and set keyframes on that keyframe, right? For all controls. Like if you're going through and setting like a code for the keyframes to get all of the controls and set those keyframes.
Yes.
Is there a way to select all controls and to just set like a huge keyframe on the board?
There is, and that's what I have here. If you'll notice, there's that shelf on the top. There's a button up there that just says all.
Okay.
There's actually two. There's all and there's all plus. All plus grabs her placement control, and there's some other keyframes on there I don't want, or other. It's like to turn her smoothing on and off. I don't want to keyframe that. So I'm just using all that selects everything. So it's selecting her face. It's selecting all of that.
And that's really like on some rigs.
It depends on the rig. Like there's different ways that works. Usually, if you open up your channel box, in your channel box you'll find most people who make rigs recognize animators want to do this, and so they make a selection set of all of the controls, and then you can just select all of those controls either in that selection set, or you can select all of them and make a button out of a script from the script editor. So I'll show you. I'll pull up an example rig here in just a few minutes, and I'll show you how to do that. Like, just try to remind me before I finish, because I think that is one of the things that is really important, is setting those keyframes, because you never know what you're going to want a keyframe on, or I think even worse is like you don't know what you didn't set a keyframe on. So when you move a pose later, it may mess up some pose you thought you were finished with, right? So this really is an important part of it, an important part of the process. I think the other thing I would point out here is that I understand a lot of people don't want to put it in step mode, and I understand that. You don't absolutely have to, but I really would encourage you to, and I'll show you why here in just a few minutes. And that's because in step mode, all I'm thinking about right here is the poses. Let me go ahead and continue on to the next video, and this will make more sense. So the flip, all I'm thinking about is the poses for this. And the reason for that is because I know this is going to mess up later, and I'm okay with that. Let future Greg deal with that. Future Greg will be more competent than current Greg because he has more life experience. So I know that when my character does this flip, the graph editor is going to freak out. Right? It's going to be like, I don't know what you just did, and it's going to try to interpret it wrong. And I can worry about that now, but if I did, I would be distracting myself from what is actually really important, which is crafting really strong poses here. If I get those poses worked out, I can deal with that graph editor stuff when that time comes, right? Like that time isn't here yet. So that's why I do the step mode. So when she does this flip, I know that it's going to mess up. I'll even show you a proof that it's going to mess up. So I'm going from the contact pose on the tree to her landing pose. And you can see what I'm doing is I'm looking at the pose in the background and trying to apply that to her, right? She's not the same character, and I think that a lot of times people resist doing this reference in the background thing, out of like an artistic integrity thing, they're like, it'll be cheating. I mean, that's cheating. And I'm like, it's not cheating because this is different. Like the animation that I get out of this is inspired by this reference. This is just a more convenient way of looking at that reference, because I've never seen anybody be able to copy reference perfectly enough for that to be considered cheating, right? Again, notice what I'm doing is I'm moving stuff over here in my perspective view while I look in my render cam view to see if the pose looks right. So I'm using my perspective view to sort of tumble around and manipulate the elements that I need. So if you're in stepped mode, if you just hit play, it'll play through it. So you can see this is what the graph editor is going to do to it. See how she's like flipping out there? And I don't want current Greg to care about that. I want future Greg to worry about that. So, so I'm going to switch that to stepped mode here in a minute. But what I'm doing to make sure I'm focusing on the key poses is using the greater than, less than keys to jump back and forth between those key poses. And that does something else too, is it lets me compare previous pose to next pose, right? And so this was really important for here. In a few minutes, you'll see like the angle in which she comes off of that tree and lands has to kind of be consistent, right? Like I don't want her to feel like in midair she wobbles over and then comes back. So I'm using the greater than, less than keys, right here you can see it. Using the greater than, less than keys to see that like she actually sort of follows the arc that I want her to follow. Now I'm just goofing off. So just kind of stepping through my keys to see how each keyframe relates to the next. So I am still thinking about how this moves. I'm just thinking only about the transition from key pose to key pose, right? So very subtle things. I recognize that one of my key poses in here, wait, did this start over or am I?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think so. Okay. Now again, I'm using a character with a face. I'm assuming you probably won't, but if you do, I would say don't worry too much about the face during the thing, but I would put it in some form of pose, just so it's not like zombie person doing backflips. Yes?
Do you typically avoid worrying about the main body control, like the big nerd circle that
On the
she
ground
starts
chart.
out with on the ground?
Yeah, that one is one, and this is something that a lot of people do, is like don't move your whole character with that during your animation. Just like that's the placement control. So what you usually do is you use that to place your character at the start of the animation, and then you move all of those other controls. Like that's the character's world, right? So like if you move that control, the IK is not going to stick to the floor, stuff like that. So I usually place it at the beginning to give me a good starting point, and then I never touch it again. And I would strongly encourage you doing that as well. The only time I ever really mess with that is if I'm doing a cycle animation. So my character is doing a run cycle in place, and I want to see what that looks like in the engine. I will set some temporary keys on my placement control to see what it looks like as that moves forward. And that's really what that's for, is like, because once you get it into a game engine, it's going to take your entire character and move that entire character around, which is what the placement control does. But really it's not, it's just for moving the entire character the first time. And that's a little complicated because really if you need to move the entire character again, you have to select multiple controls to do it, right? And so how I usually do that is I select the root control, like whatever's around the hips that move the character up and down. Some call it the center of gravity, some call it root. Some of them call it hips. And then whatever IK controls I have. So the IK feet, and if you're posing your character with IK hands, I'll grab the IK arms. And then I'll move that in the world translate axis, right, instead of local. And that way you can kind of still just slide the whole character around and get them roughly placed. Does that make sense? Yeah. Again, if you have questions at any point, please chime in. I think this is working. I think that I'm getting the information I want to get into your head at a much more, a much less boring experience for you, hopefully. Still may not be the most exciting thing, but it's much better than watching me animate this in real time, which was about 6 hours, 6 or 7 hours, I think is what it took. So at this point, I did a play blast to see what it was looking like, and I thought you would probably be interested too, right? This is what I have. Now, the reason I'm doing this in step mode is because all of that other stuff is messed up, and I know it's messed up. But now is not the time to fix it. Like, future is the time to fix it, because if I don't do it in stepped mode, what I see is this, which looks like absolutely nothing successful, right? Like, and this is also kind of partially for your emotional well-being, right? If you worked for 4 hours and that's what you saw, you'd be like, oh, I'm in the wrong major. I'm going to geology, right? Like, that doesn't feel like an accomplishment. Whereas to me, this is looking pretty good. If I see what I'm supposed to be thinking about, and only those things, I see some strong poses in there. And when I ask somebody for feedback, they don't say stupid stuff like, your character's flip is broken, right? Like, yeah, I know. They can give me feedback on the things I really need feedback on, which are these poses. And this one isn't, like, I actually make changes to these poses as I go along, so I can see little things that would be more clear. But if I uploaded this to Sync Sketch and asked you to give me feedback on it, you could give me feedback that I could implement immediately that would make positive impacts on it, not just sort of a generic comment on how it's not finished, right? So I also do that because then animation is a long process. I have a friend who owns a game studio, or manages a game studio, and I was talking to him the other day, and he said, I remember how he said it exactly. I wish I would have recorded it. He said, the animation process he said the game animation process in the short run is actually pretty painful, but it's very gratifying in the long run. And I was like, yeah, that's right. Like when you're thinking about it while you're animating it, you're like, this is a lot of work. And what you need is to build things into your workflow that give you gratification from the work you've done, right? It feels really good after you've put 40 hours into an animation and you see that animation and it looks awesome. But that meant you had to wait 40 hours to feel good, right? And that sucks. So when you do it this way, when you do it in stepped mode, you get to feel good every time you look at a successful pose that you made, right? You get to get this little neurofeedback of positive reinforcement for each pose, because each pose was a success, not the entire animation, because the animation is the culmination, is that a word? The culminating result of all of those poses. So, moving on, so I recognize that pose maybe wasn't enough to completely define the entire flip, because her flip has a couple of distinct elements in it. So I started adding a couple of more key poses to the flip to make sure that, actually I'm doing it partially for a technical reason. I want to make sure that Maya later understands that this is a 360-degree rotation on this character, right? Not the character flipping upside down and then flipping back the regular way, or right side up in the reverse way, right? So I wanted to make this pose that was like the extra key pose where she's like kind of on her back in midair. And I recognized there were a couple of important elements there. This was sort of partially the last point where she was sort of touching her knees, or him in the reference. It was also the point where she's starting to reach her foot down to catch herself, right? It's really interesting watching this. Little by little, you start to recognize, oh, he's looking at the place he's going to land, until the last minute where he can't, and then he curls up, and then as soon as he can look again where he's going to land, he looks again. So this is the point where he's blind, right? This is the point where he has no idea where he's going to land. So really all I was working on was just getting this extra pose in here. But the reason I left this as a single video is because I worked forever on this pose. This was like 30 minutes, 20 minutes on this one pose for a whole bunch of little bitty stuff, like trying to get the silhouette clear on the knees and the feet and the hands touching. I'm still not 100% happy with it, but I'm much happier with it after I fought with it for a while. I also made some transitions in her overall path. You can see it there. And made some changes to it. But yeah, you'll see a little bit later here when I kind of pull her knees up a little bit, start getting her arms on here. Like this started getting really muddy. It felt like both of her hands and both of her knees were all kind of jumbled into one area of the screen. And that didn't feel appealing to look at to me. So I had to push that little bits at a time to try to clear up that silhouette as much as I could. I still wish it could be a little clearer, but I think it worked out pretty well. Really, my solution was to kind of hide one of her hands. Her hand is on the back side. I'm just not making it very evident. And I'm letting her, like this hand, you see I'm trying to clear up that silhouette where it's like she's reaching, but I'm giving some negative space in between the knee and the arm. And I know that that seems like minor stuff, but again, like this is your eyes picking up on frames over and over and over again, and that's little stuff that you may not see, but you'll feel, and your brain will just calculate it. Your brain will just crunch that all together into an understanding of this motion. So that little bit of extra clarity is worth the 20 minutes I spent on it. So I have my contact pose for where she contacts the ground, right? But I needed the squash, and I started to realize where I'd put my video reference was not the best, so I sort of rearranged it a little bit. I got some stuff in this video reference I didn't expect to get. I've got a whole bunch of stuff in this video reference. But one is, when he hits the ground, his feet don't just stick to the ground. They sort of smoosh forward a little bit. Like he kind of slides just a little bit on impact. I never would have put that little element into this if I wasn't using reference, right? Again, trying to keep my silhouettes clear. And I'm trying to read into what his pose is actually expressing, like not what he's trying to say with it, but why he did the thing he did. So he has this, like, both of his hands are kind of palm forward, which I think is a physiological reaction to trying to stop yourself. Like if you start to if like you hit the brakes on your car because somebody in front of you stops suddenly, like the passenger's going to do something like this, right? It's like this knee-jerk reaction to trying to stop yourself. So I tried to exaggerate that a little bit in her pose. Let me go back there a little bit so you can see that. So like I'm trying to sort of exaggerate that like hand pushing down toward the ground thing that she's doing in her pose to make that a clearer gesture, right? She's pushing her hands down to try to stop herself. So this is where I'm adding if the previous pose was the contact pose, this is the squash from that contact or the overlapping action. And then I try to get her back into that, like that ready to fight stance that she has at the end. So this is me just having fun with the face because like I like posing her with an angry face. But he does this really neat thing that again I wouldn't have gotten without the video reference. As he stands back up, he does a little bitty tiny jump backwards, and he drags his shoulders and shoves his like arms down like this. And that's what's giving it that like ready for the next thing like feel to it, right? So that's what I'm trying to push in her pose as she sort of pops back up, is like dragging her shoulders in this forcible like shoving her arms back into this like let's fight pose, right? I think like when it's all said and done, I'm going to have like a little like tiny robot or something that's chasing her and crashes into the tree like underneath it, and that's like she like does a dive over top of it. I think that's where I would like to go with it. So again, moving some stuff around so I can see it more clearly. I think this started over, yeah. Okay, so we're on 7. Okay, so this is me just finishing up the rest of it. I think it was Brandon that asked, but I get this question a lot. How many poses do I need for blocking? Like, what do I need to set for my blocking? What is blocking? How do I know when I'm done with blocking? And that's kind of a moving target in terms of an answer, because everybody has a little bit of a different answer and every shot has a little bit of a different answer. For me, I look for the things that I think are necessary to understand this action with no other input, right? I want to be able to email this to somebody who has no idea who I am, and I still want them to be able to watch this and understand roughly what I'm going for, right? So I gave her some other running poses to make that clearer. The jump pose here, I wanted that point where he really pushes off from the tree, partially because he does something really neat. The pose before it, he throws his arms back, and how he jumps is he throws his arms forward to get that centrifugal, or is it a, whatever, like that rotation force out of it, right? So it's a jump with this added circular momentum because of how he throws his arms. So that pose is really important, I think. I've never actually successfully done a front flip like that, but I assume that pose is really important in the physics of this. It's not the lowest pose. There's still another pose that's like one frame away where he like kind of dips just a little bit before that. But that is one of the big things I was going for. What did you say?
Yeah, I remember last year, I forgot what class it was in, but you gave us this Word document kind of outlining exactly what step.
Yes, I'll put that up there.
Okay, perfect.
I'll put that up there.
Also explain what that kind of means.
Yes, let me put that up. Thank you for reminding me of that.
Yeah.
I meant to put that up, and this is the right time to do it. So again, yeah, putting some more running poses in there. I think that some people would say this is underkeyed. Some people would probably agree with me that this is a good spot for blocking. You also see that I did a little bit of timing change on the run. He does this like run in place thing as he's running up to it, and I wanted it to feel like she was actually running forward more. But yeah, just figuring out what is enough information to communicate the action, right? Now, that doesn't, I feel like, this is where, like there are still other little motions I could describe with key poses, right? And I will, but that's the breakdown phase. And the reason I want to stop at blocking and get feedback is because the breakdowns are just transitions from key poses to key poses. And this is where somebody could give me, I'm going to tell you more about this tool here in a little bit too, the Tween Machine. That's actually something I'm going to use for breakdowns. I'm going to show you all how to install it. But the breakdown poses, I'm sorry, the key poses are those main storytelling poses, right? And so when you ask people for feedback at this point, they can give you feedback on those poses, and you can change it pretty easily, right? But if I have things that are connected to each of those key poses for breakdowns, like how I ease out of one pose or how I drag from one pose to the other, then it's then that feedback is going to impact more of the work that I have to do. So asking for feedback at this point really helps me just make this part as bulletproof as possible, so I can make whatever necessary changes I need to and move on to that next step. So what I'm going to be going over next few class periods is the breakdown process and the splining process. And it really just depends on how much I can get done and recorded before the class period when we're going to do that, which is a week from today. I thought you'd want to see, like, this is the blocking pass unsmooth or unstepped, like in the auto tangent, right? And you can see, like, it's looking better, but it's still got those technical problems that would drive us nuts if that's how it looked every time we hit play, right? And so that's very unsatisfying to see it looking like this. Hopefully it's much more satisfying to see it looking like this, and I'm actually pretty happy with where this is at. I will say, I finished this up like, I think yesterday afternoon, something like that. And what's almost guaranteed going to happen is when I sit back down to work on this some more, I'm going to see things that I don't like about it. That's normal. Like, basically, I call it snow blindness. You've been staring at this file for so long, or this animation for so long, that you start to miss the little bitty things. So one of the things I do want to show you that is, and I've shown this to you before, that will really help you see it with fresh eyes, is to flip this. Now, if you're using VLC, that's probably one of the easier ways to do this. If I go to video, no, I'm sorry, it's not video. Tools, effects and filters, video effect, geometry, and then under transform, I'm going to set this to flip horizontally. Now I can watch this with some fresh eyes because I've never seen it from this angle before. And to me, just watching, like, this is the first time I've done this for this one, I feel like her forward momentum dies in the air a little bit. Like, it's almost a little bit too much rotation momentum. And so, like, I'm seeing a couple of little things I will probably change, probably a little bit more based on her positioning in the air, and maybe her landing location. So this is a really beneficial way of looking at your own animation and giving yourself feedback. You will see elements in it that you didn't see before that help you, like, sort of critique your own work. So, any other questions, comments on any of this? Okay. Is this helpful? Yeah. Okay. I think this is a better way of doing it than making you watch me animate for 20 hours, right? However, I will say, like, I'm not the only one who does this, right? Like, there are lots of other animators who work on shots and say, hey, come watch me work on this shot. There's a couple of people, I don't remember the name of it, but I do think some of them are listed on that animation resource kit, who would just go on Twitch and animate. And I know y'all are busy, but that is a really beneficial way of getting better at this, like seeing how somebody else works. Because what I'm showing you right now is my process, not the only process. Every animator works a little differently. I know animators who put all of their key poses on individual frames, so they make their animation 10 frames long. And for their first pose, they do it on frame 1, and their second pose, they do it on frame 2, and their third pose, they do it on frame 3. That way, they're not even thinking about timing at all. They're just looking at the pose. I like using the video reference in the timeline and pulling some of my timing information from that. I will say I usually exaggerate that timing later, just because I like to exaggerate my animations. So I mean, like, there's lots of different workflows, and once we start getting into how people spline and work in the graph editor, like, it gets even more drastically different. So I would say, like, the benefit of this is not to try to copy me exactly, but to take whatever it was you heard in this and apply it to how you're working to get a better result. But hopefully there were some notes in there that you'll remember. So Charlie mentioned the list, and he also mentioned, somebody mentioned setting up a selection set. So I'm going to show you those really quick as well. this one? No, I clicked the wrong one. Let me figure this out here. Yeah. Is this the list you're talking about?
Yeah, and you know, something like that.
Yeah. So this is a little bit more of what we're going to go like once we get into the graph editor. But I'll go ahead and put this up there now anyway, just in the resources.
I remember seeing it was a document for like the entire process, though, not just scoring. I could be wrong. It could have just been that one.
Was it? Yeah, I'll keep looking and see if I can find it. So I will put this one, animation workflow images. It wasn't these, was it?
No.
Okay. Yeah, let me look and see if I have that. So I will say the second question of how to make a selection set is actually pretty, making a selection button is pretty easy. If I select multiple objects, so grab these 3 objects here. If I want to be able to select them with a single button, how I can do that is open up my script editor and then select them all individually. There, hold shift, there, and then highlight this, middle click, and drop it in my tab here, or my shelf. And so now I have a button that should select all 3 of those just with one click, right? Yes. So basically, what I want you to notice is that whenever I click something here in the viewport, I get a little piece of script that fires off like the mail script for selecting. So if I select the first one, hold shift, second, third, then it means that's the script to select all 3 of those, right? You could also probably drag select and it'll do it all in one line, right? So all I gotta do is highlight that piece of script that fired to select all 3 of those, and then middle click, drag, and release here. It's going to ask what type of script. It's a mail script, and so that will create a button. So I use this to do any sort of selection sets. So if I have a character rig, oh, I also want to show you one more thing. I put some extra rigs up here in the resources folder. They're called game rigs. These are the rigs we're going to be using later for project 2. But somebody else pointed out that like some of these may be rigs you would want to use now. This is sort of the set that we have. These are rigs that I made, so you're welcome to use them if you want to use one of them for this project as well. So I'm just going to open up one of those characters really quick. I'll do the bulky mail.
Do you have to write custom tab or
Any tab, and you can actually create your own tabs if you want to. Like you can create a new tab up here that's just like your selection sets or wherever you want to put it. Okay. So this is the rig, and like the reason dragging and selecting doesn't always work is like I just did that and it didn't select all the curves, right? It's because it's also selecting this joint here, and it's selecting other elements. So when I created this rig, if you look, really? Yeah. When I created this rig, if you look all the way down here at the bottom, there's this A tool set purple all. It's a weird name for it, but basically that is all of the controls for this character. Right? And so if I wanted to make a button that selected just the controls, again, I would get that script editor up. Sometimes this just gets messy, so I'll do edit, clear all, and then I'll select the top one, hold shift, select the bottom one, and so those 2 lines of code will select every control in my rig, and I can middle mouse and drag that to my shelf. If you want to customize it a little more, you can actually make custom icons for this, but if you just want to have like a name that you can read under there, you can right click on that and go to edit, and under shelves with that section selected, you can give it an icon label. I can just call this all and say save all shelves. There we go. And so now I know that's my all button. Selects everything. Does that make sense? Okay. Other questions while like the video's still recording? Things that you may have issues with, want to ask questions about? All right. So I'm curious about what you're working on. But that's everything I had to lecture about today. Like I really wanted to get through that. I'm surprised my voice is still working, so I'm going to save it as much as I can for the next class. So the rest of the class is yours. Like you can be working on stuff. I know some of you like to work from home, but I would really like to see kind of sort of browsing around the room, see what y'all are working on. Any questions you have for me, anything you need help with. Just have some one-on-one time with you. I probably won't get super close to you because I don't want to get you sick if I am still contagious. And it sounds like I am, but I know this sounds crazy. I feel so much better. So I don't know what's happening. But that's what most of the rest of the class today is. So the rest of it's yours. Make sure you sign the attendance sheet, but otherwise, the rest of it's yours.
Tuesday for the first block.
Yeah, next class period, Tuesday. It's not something I grade like the quality of it. It's going to be, you get a grade for submitting it for critique that day on the discussion board. So how that day will work is we'll come into class, everybody will kind of settle in. I'll tell you to go to that discussion board and post your sync sketch link for the file. So that means if you go ahead and get that uploaded beforehand, that'll be more efficient. And then we'll just take like 45 minutes, an hour in class to just critique those. You'll need to critique everybody who is in your group on the D2L board, and you can read that there. But if you want to critique more, that's awesome. I'm also, at least for the next few classes, going to continue to bring pins to class in case you're like, this will be easier if I can sketch on it. But I think you don't have to do it that way either. I also will say if you have a tablet or if you feel more comfortable on a phone, you can load up those sync sketch links on your phone too and sort of draw over it that way. Phone feels a little small to me, but I've tried it out with a tablet and it was actually pretty effective. So I'm kind of excited about it. I hope it works out pretty well. We may take a few minutes before we do that where I sort of give you a quick demo of it by doing a critique of another piece. And that's something I kind of want to do is sort of talk about how to give that feedback. So we'll see how that goes. Really kind of depends on our pacing of it. So, all right, cool. I'm going to shut up. Eli, you had a question. Okay, let me stop this video first.